Welcome to URL Unzip, Reboot, and Leave, a podcast about the psychology that moves us. Through real conversations with thinkers, doers, and seekers, we explore how we adapt, evolve, and find meaning. So let's unzip, reboot, and leave. When we talk about transport, normally we mean roads, rails, budgets, but maybe transport is actually about power, dignity, identity, and who a city decides to serve. Our guest is a transport planner with nearly 5 decades of experience. In last 10 years, his focus is on sanity and sustainability in transport planning. Please welcome William McDougall. How are you, William?
Very well, thank you.
Thanks for your time.
That's a pleasure.
So today our topic is psychology of transport or psychology of public transport. So that means we would like to understand behind the scene how the leadership and the government think about the transport and how you as a planner see it. Is transport just a movement of people or is it a statement about freedom, dignity, and belonging? What is the view in the top level?
I think in the levels of government, it's where most of the decisions are made. There's a mixture. I would say it's mostly the former. It's really about just moving people and goods, bearing in mind freight transport as well. It's very wrapped up in politics as well in Australia. That's where it gets a little more complicated and difficult to comprehend. For people, obviously, transport and mobility, let's say, the ability to move freely, easily, economically, sustainably, and all these other factors is really central to well-being and life in general. I think policymakers and decision makers often forget, how essential it really is.
Why do some people feel more in control in private cars while others feel more free in public systems? The reason I'm asking it because if it is only about money, then a lot of people are going to office by cycle. So is car culture a symptom of individualism, status, and public transport is more about collective trust? How you see it?
Yes, I think so. Car culture is very strong in Australia. People love their cars and they're very protective, very enthusiastic about their cars and the history of cars and so on and so on. I think there's a lot of love of cars in Australia and not just as a form of transport, but as, hobbies and enjoyment of travel, driving and sightseeing and so on, as well as just the routine of getting around. Whereas public transport, whilst it has a small number of fans of real sort of followers and fans, we call them gunzels. I think it's more, again, it's more probably utilitarian transport for more people than car might be seen as. That's one of the reasons why getting people to choose public transport instead of car when both are not really have great advantages one over the other, it's quite difficult to sort of wean people off their cars, if you like, and onto public transport and more sustainable forms of transport, except obviously for journeys to and from work in dense centres like city centres, for example, where there's often very limited parking or high cost parking, and also quite congested roads in and out. And often then the car journey is more stressful and more expensive as well than using public transport. So that's a factor too, I think.
Why do some cities like Melbourne, London invest in public transport heavily, while similar kind of city like LA or Brisbane lean towards more cars?
Well, historically, it's been sort of cyclical. We've spent most of the last century adapting cities and towns to the growth in car use and the growth in car ownership. It's really only in the last, I'd say probably starting 1980s or perhaps a bit earlier than that, that we started to try and redress the imbalance, if you like, because a lot of cities were closing down some of their public transport, especially transport that was using the roads, like streetcars and trams, because they wanted to create more space for cars. And that was very much the nature of planning in cities in the latter half of the 20th century, I think. But then probably in the 1970s, there was more of a shift towards the realization that public transport was, maybe there was a lot more thought about sustainability. Was starting to realize that we have a limited life ahead of us using fossil fuels, and that there was a need to decouple movement from the use of fossil fuels as much as possible. And I think that's when, and perhaps that was the sort of start of my career in the 70s and when I moved to Australia in the 1980s, there was more effort to start to try and reinvest in public transport again. And it's been varied in some cities and rather than others. And you've asked about more car reliant places, perhaps like LA and Brisbane, although very recently Brisbane has done quite a lot more to invest in public transport. Melbourne has always been problematic. We haven't, through investment in public transport, we haven't really changed the mode share of public transport for journey making over the last 25 years. It's stayed pretty constant. So the city's been growing very strongly, but we haven't really increased the role of public transport. And probably because we've invested in roads and public transport simultaneously, and some fairly major investments in things like CityLink in the 90s and now into the 2000s. We've been seeing quite a lot of development of further roads, and at the moment, they're building the Westgate Tunnel and the Northeast Link. It's two fairly large road projects. By comparison, there hasn't been the same level of investment in public transport to change that status quo very much at all, I think. So I think a lot of that's to do with politics. When you asked why the reasons for those sort of situations, I think it's at a federal level and also at the state level of governments. They've been very, very focused. It seems to be an ideological thing as well amongst certain politicians that cars and the freedom that goes with them, perhaps more than public transport, is seen as car use is seen as almost like a right amongst people, whereas public transport, the cost of running public transport, when it always does cost taxpayers more than it earns from fare revenue, so it always has to be subsidized. And the words used for that subsidy, things like public service obligation, that's something we're obliged to do, can't use cars, or for some reason, that mentality has always existed until perhaps in more recent times. And talking about public transport deficit, whereas, we never talk about road deficit in the same terms. We don't talk about how much taxpayer money is going into roads with little return compared to public transport. And it's that sort of a difference in mentality, I suppose, or approach to roads versus public transport quite strong.
Transport planners design cities, or cities just happening in its own mind, and then you guys have to catch up with it?
That's quite an interesting question. We like to think as transport planners that we're looking into the future and trying to plan for the future. But I'd say most of the time, although that's been the focus of my career, for example, most of the time while we're predicting need and so on and so forth, there are sort of two approaches. There's a predict and provide approach, where we've tried to anticipate levels of demand and changes in patterns of travel around a city as it grows with more population or changes in location of employment and zones and so on. We tried to predict where the transport system would need to be improved or expanded to maintain capacity. The choice between roads and public transport is then a secondary to that first question. Where have we got a capacity problem, if you like? But then, I mean, that's what we seem to be doing all the time. But then when you look backwards at how successful we've been with that sort of planning approach, I'd say we've been very unsuccessful because there have been changes in trends that we haven't anticipated, or continuing perhaps certain rigidity in people that they won't choose to use public transport or cycling or walking, active transport as well, perhaps because of inconvenience or climate or all sorts of different reasons. And there have been times also where we've been planning for change in transport, and we've been, for example, planning to increase public transport's mode share by building more public transport and renewing the vehicles and updating the system, more frequent timetables and so on. And I think it probably was the mid 2000s or about 2006 or 2007. There was a period where public transport patronage was growing very strongly. It caught everyone by surprise. And I think the reasons for it were increased awareness, especially amongst young people, about the environmental benefits of using public transport as opposed to driving cars, that it was a more sustainable way of getting around. And to some extent, perhaps the cost of living pressures and other things like that. But also possibly the change that was also happening about the same time was the regeneration of inner city areas around areas where probably up until the 60s or the 70s, maybe through into the 80s in some cities, they were sprawling and growing by adding population around the outside rather than regenerating the perhaps sometimes tired semi-industrial areas in the inner parts of the cities. In Melbourne, places like Collingwood and so on were full of old warehouses and factories, and they were difficult to regenerate. But as the regeneration and sort of gentrification of those inner suburbs started to take proportions, I think that was also pushing an increase in public transport use, because it was denser parts of the city and more public transport was more common sense to get around. That phenomenon, that increase in public transport use, was happening globally and not just in Australia for all sorts of reasons. That's why we think it was probably mainly in parallel with people's realizations about reducing emissions and taking more personal responsibility to do that. And car driving license holding was going down at the same time. People were choosing not to have a driving license because they wouldn't need it as they were using public transport.
Yeah, eventually no one need that. They're
Yeah, yeah.
self-driving everything. Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting because that was a period where suddenly we were getting this increase in public transport use, which we'd been hoping for a long time and trying to plan for, and then it took us all by surprise.
Yeah.
Happened without increasing public transport. It was mainly getting public transport up to the capacity, or more. It was getting more full of people because it was, and the peak periods were spreading a bit because buses and trains were more empty away from the middle of the peak, of the commuter peak. So people were traveling earlier and later to get a seat and things like that. Yeah, it was interesting.
How government or engineers or whoever in that leadership decide that, okay, we need rail or tram or monorail or bus or ferry or cable car, like there are all sorts of things.
Yes.
So how they decide, how this decision took place?
Again, I think there's been a shift in my career. I've seen a shift from very much concentration on roads and car use, and then shifting more to upgrading facilities for walking and cycling as well as public transport. A lot of that comes from a political response to community wishes, and concerns about things like sustainability. It's always been, in my experience, sort of alternatives to car use have never been funded to the same degree, especially things like cycleways and shared paths and facilities for human-powered transport, let's say, they never really seem to get enough investment. And again, it's a sort of a vicious circle because it's only when you improve the facilities that you get more usage of active transport, for example. And the same applies to public transport. When there's always an easy alternative to jump in the car, and for most people that seems to be, the sort of the fail-safe. Let's say it's always difficult to justify investment in the lesser modes, and they are the lesser modes, unfortunately. They're more sustainable and make more sense in terms of emissions and safety and everything else. They are the minority in Australia. Most travel is done by car in cities and in regional areas as well.
A little bit of like an offshoot of it, the famous
Mm.
book Game of Mates, how favors blame the
Yeah.
nation, and then probably they changed the book name by Rigged later on. So it
Mm.
talks about like how mining and insurance sector, systems are kind of
Yeah.
rigged that way. So have you seen this kind of thing in this infrastructure game you are in?
Yeah, definitely. Too much. And there's a lot of a common feature. I think the way in which the car companies in particular were lobbying for more road space, lobbying for um, parking and so on and so forth, and ease of access and the right of access as well to roads that happened in the last century, particularly as cars grew in popularity and ease of use and so on. Motor industry in the US, for example, the large car making companies, manufacturers, were buying up streetcar systems in the cities so that they could close them down and make more space on the roads for car use. And this was a particular feature of the change in cities in the last century. And also, another very strong trend alongside that was that the use of streets by pedestrians, which was always, the case when before the advent of the motor car. You look at a streetscape of a pre-motor era, and people and horses and coaches and other forms of transport. There were no sidewalks in many cases. There was an open space between buildings, which was really used by everybody, and pedestrians would walk around that space fairly freely and easily. But when with the motor car coming along and the speed differential was so big as they became more numerous and faster, then they were corralling the pedestrians and the other uses of the public realm to the sides of the streets to make sure there was room for cars to race through. Public ordinances on things like jaywalking laws were changed to give cars priority. And then I think in the 21st century, we've seen a bit of a shift back in the other direction. For example, in the UK, to a lesser extent in Australia, but in the UK, the highway code, which was the guidelines and rules for using the roads, were rewritten 10 years or so ago to put the more vulnerable road users first. In other words, the cyclists, the walkers, to make sure that road use and the codes governing road use would put them at a higher priority than cars and trucks and so on. To see that happening more in Australia as well, speed limits being reduced and those sort of things to make places safer for people who aren't in cars to use. Living with the motor car is so normal that most people, are used to making sure that they've got to look both ways before they step into the street, out into the roadway, and things like this. Whereas before cars were around, they never used to think about that. So I think that's, the way in which cars are now a normal part of our existence is fascinating way of looking at it, because it means that all the other modes of transport are really secondary. in one way or another.
In these road lobbies or car
Mm.
manufacturing interest, okay, we understand that those are probably in a national level. Is there any international body also come and pressurize to do certain things quicker than others?
Yeah, as I mentioned, the car manufacturers in particular, and you've seen it in more recent times where there's been a strong trend, as well as electrification of vehicles, but to larger vehicles, SUVs and twin cab utes and things like that. Much bigger vehicles than we really need, and certainly much bigger than we used to use. Small hatchbacks and cars that were much more economical on fuel when we had fuel crises or a high cost of fuels relative to income and so on. But the motor industry seems to have been successful in marketing the status symbol of a car in the way that it
Bigger.
makes them bigger as well. And there seems to be a strong element of status attached to the size of your car these days. The popularity of large SUVs. I mean, they make no sense in the safety sense, in a fuel consumption sense, and they get in the way visually as well. You can't see around them. You can't see, you know, uh, they're very safe for the people who are inside them, but they're very dangerous for everyone who's outside them, and increased danger of being run over. They're heavier, so they do more damage to the roads. They have longer braking distances because they're heavier as well. So they don't make sense from a safety and point of view, but their growth has been astronomical in recent times, in Australia in particular, and also in the States. Much less so in Europe because the medieval street layouts and so on in European cities just can't handle that size of vehicle to the same extent. And it's the same in Japan as well, in the big cities in Japan. They're much more space constrained. There's certainly an international, we don't make any cars in Australia anymore. And so we're very much driven and at the whim of the trends and fashions in vehicles that are determined somewhere else and then sold to us.
Hmm. So, how this electric vehicle and driverless cars, they are
Yes.
actually started giving pressure to the system, like how close we are. Because from a normal layman, sometimes I think it's just a matter of a decision from a government. Yeah, you can drive driverless car. That's it. Deal is done.
Yeah, yeah. It's a lack of decision of developing real policies about these things. I mean, the idea of um, autonomous vehicles in particular, and to a lesser extent EVs, because they're still the same in terms of how they're driven. Um, but autonomy in vehicles has the potential to change and make the road system much more efficient by the vehicles being able to travel much closer together, for example, more safely. The reaction time of an autonomous vehicle is much quicker than the reaction time of a human driver and things like that. So they can safely travel much more closely together. And if you imagine what happens to a cohort of cars waiting at a green light, waiting for a green light, the human drivers they take one after another very slowly start to move off in a queue. But you can imagine autonomous vehicles will, as a
And
block, will all
and
start moving together.
and in some cities, everyone tries to go fast and create a chaos.
Congested
Yeah.
situation because it's not uniform flow. It's very uneven and blockages caused by small groups of cars. I think the big issue here is car ownership because we now have got to the point where car ownership has exceeded expectations. We own more cars per head of population than was ever thought possible in the 70s and 60s. The theories were that there was a limit of about, I can't remember the number, but about 0.6 of a car per person. And we're now seeing car ownership rates much higher than that, in the 0.8, 0.9. And you see 2 and 3 car households are commonplace. And most of those cars spend probably only about 3 to 5% of their time being used. And the rest of the time they're parked somewhere in a garage at home or at work or, doing nothing. And they're just there for one purpose, to get you to your destination. And then they sit there waiting for you to go home again. But autonomous vehicles don't need us to drive them. And if we had a situation where, a bit like Apple and Google and others have been proposing, and Waymo, the Meta, Facebook Meta company, Waymo, they've been putting out fleets of autonomous vehicles into cities for shared use, as a ride hire, ride share type, taxi type operations. And if we were able to decouple car ownership and just instead have a fleet of vehicles which would be much more highly utilized, they'd be in use much higher proportions of the time, rather than this 3 to 5% of a privately owned cars in the way that they're used. The number of cars to fulfill the transport task would shrink enormously, the fleet size. But, the car makers wouldn't like that to happen, because they'll be selling fewer cars. And the policymakers seem to be in the thrall of the car makers most of the time. And but if we had some policies where we actually tried to encourage things like fleets of autonomous vehicles to fulfill our travel needs on a much larger scale, and also autonomous public transport vehicles for the more mass transit corridors where you need to move large numbers of people in as small a space as possible, trains and buses and trams and so on. We'd reduce the cost of public transport as well by taking out a large proportion of labour cost if they're driverless. So we don't seem to be anticipating what these technologies could offer and how we could make them more efficient in our cities in the future. I did some work about 10 years ago while I was in the Department of Transport, looking at these ideas, and some of the potential changes to take full advantage of autonomous technology, driverless vehicle technology. We could slash the amount of road crashes and accidents, and the whole system would become much safer and more efficient. Obviously, once they really do take on the majority of the task, when you've got only a small number of driverless cars around, you've got the majority still being piloted by humans in one way or another. So you don't get the efficiencies until you've got mostly autonomous vehicles. So it might be a long way off, but people have done forecasts, and they are reckoning that I've seen forecasts of between 10, 15 years from now that we'll see autonomous vehicles taking a large proportion of the task. But at the same time, if we were to do something and rethink the idea of car ownership, then we would start to legislate for that and encourage that with taxation settings and various things. We could make our roads much more efficient and safer for the same transport task. Um, it would be really interesting. So, but that would also take a strong stance from a policy point of view. And we don't seem to be able to do that. Most cities were taken by surprise when Uber, for example, came into being a little while ago. And Uber was essentially it was an app, and you could become an Uber driver with your own car as long as you had access to the app and you joined in and you paid the fee to go out and get passengers and to get an income. And most cities didn't anticipate this. It just was rolled out. Some places outlawed it to begin with to protect their own taxi industries, conventional taxi industries. Other places, there was a very difficult sort of adaptation period where Uber was uh, becoming very widespread, but it was catching policymakers by surprise almost. And now it seems to have settled down, and they're a significant part of the transport task. I think they've taken most of the patronage away from conventional taxis, and it looks to me as though at the moment in Melbourne, for example, Uber or rideshare offerings are taking two-thirds of what used to be the taxi market. And the taxi market hasn't shrunk by two-thirds. They've taken some of the market from private car use as well. It's been very interesting to see how it's come into play, and none of that was anticipated and legislated for and thought through how to make it as efficient as possible, to make it something we can take advantage of in terms of these new technologies. It was mostly we're playing catch up, and the same with things like e-scooters and so on, and e-bikes coming onto the market, mostly very overpowered, very exciting forms of transport, but no regulation attached to them, and they're using footpaths and mowing down pedestrians and all sorts of things because we haven't been able to legislate for them properly. So we're playing catch up with a lot of this technology all the time, I think.
Mm, mm. As you were working with sanity and sustainability, I
Mm,
understand. Sanity, are these what you would describe comes under sanity, right?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, it's a bit of both because they are more sustainable. The personal mobility offerings nowadays are take up much less road space, and they can be a lot cheaper to use, and they don't produce emissions in the same way as the private cars do. But we still seem to protect this dinosaur, if you like, the fossil fuel driven private car in the face of these new technologies coming on board. And it's difficult.
So when you plan this transport system, any emotional mapping comes into play, like how people will feel about it, the well-being
Hmm,
of the people. I mean, one thing you mentioned that like a pedestrian comes like a top of the thing, that is definitely a well-being factor. So,
yes.
so there are any other things you can think of?
I think increasingly we're seeing with that shift to a more sustainable and also equitable transport system,
Mm,
that can be, one of the major disadvantages about car use is that you have to be fit and healthy and able to drive a car and hold a driving license and so on. And a lot of people aren't. They have disabilities in one form or another, or um, and or they prefer not to use a car. And we're now seeing street public realm improvements which give more priority to people who aren't in cars. And I think that's quite a positive step. It's making the urban realm more pleasant, quieter, slower, more peaceful in many ways, and safer in particular. It's starting in small scale, probably things like, if you think of Melbourne and the laneways, there's a program to green the laneways to make them more pedestrian friendly, and to landscape and perhaps get rid of the sidewalks so that they're just one space, and they use the shared zones where the cars have to give way to pedestrians and any other road users, or any other cyclists and other types. And this philosophy or this approach makes them much safer places and more pleasant places, with a lot more public art and planting, and breaking up the straight lines and more sort of curvilinear features in the landscape, which makes them more human, I think, as well, makes them more relatable on a human scale. And we're seeing a lot of that happening. And I think transport planners are starting to collaborate a lot more with architects, for example, in making this sort of thing happen than they have done in the past. And there's quite a strong movement, again, probably driven by the need for, or the increased popularity of other modes, not rather than cars, to make the public realm much less car-centric.
Okay, I'm from India, and in Kolkata, the city I'm from, in last probably 15 years or so, there are a lot of flyovers being built. So 2 layers of road, 3 layers of road. So these also comes under public transport planning, right? Or how, like, why this decision they take?
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure, because we haven't done that much here, but maybe in India, it's also about getting more priority or more separation, perhaps, for cars from other road users as well. But it probably is particularly a way to in urban areas, the biggest capacity constraint are the intersections. And in Australia, in a city with lots of traffic signals, it's the traffic signals that are driving the travel times more than the traveling between those points. And so if you grade separate the interchanges, which is what you've described, you put in an interchange with slip roads and ramps to enable the turning movements to happen. And that enables more throughput of cars than an at-grade crossing traffic signal. Now, we only really use those grade-separated interchanges, road interchanges, in motorways and freeways in Australia and the UK and America and so on. And that sort of is the way that we don't do that grade separation very much to roads that are not motorways and freeways. So that's why we have a large network in Australian cities of traffic signals everywhere. And what we have seen more recently in Melbourne in particular is removal of road rail level crossings, where railway tracks cross at grade. And we've seen the tracks being raised or lowered, or the roads being raised or lowered to separate that conflict. But most of that, to my way of thinking, the benefits have been mainly to cars and getting cars to go through the transport network a little bit faster, because they don't have to stop at a level crossing and wait for a train to come past and so on. but they've only got to go down a few hundred meters down the road and there's another traffic signal, so it's the benefits are limited, but they're mostly to the road traffic rather than the trains. We don't seem to have been able to redesign the train timetables, for example, to get more frequency and faster train travel times, because we're removing the limitations to the trains of those level crossings as well. It then needs a rejig of the timetables before you can reap the benefits for the trains themselves. And that doesn't seem to have happened to the same extent. Again, public transport is playing second fiddle in many ways to private transport. All the benefits of this level crossing program, the billions of dollars that have gone into it, have been mainly to improve traffic travel times. And also, the level crossings were never the most dangerous places on the road network either. The most dangerous places are the road crossings, not the road rail crossings. It's where cars crash into each other. Happens a lot more often than cars crashing into trains. The safety benefit is pretty small as well.
Well, how you decide, or how engineers decide that, okay, in this crossing, there will be red light, there will be roundabout, there will be no red light. These
Yeah.
decisions, how they make it? Is it driven by traffic? I mean, car traffic or human traffic?
Yeah. Traditionally, the decisions have been made based on capacity and what's the best solution to get cars through quickly. And that's one of the reasons why there are a lot more traffic signals in Australia than there are roundabouts, for example. Because roundabouts they're safer. They've been proven to be safer because there are fewer conflict points. But they're not as high capacity as traffic signals. They work best when the arms of the roundabout have got fairly equal levels of traffic on them. So you're not holding them up too much by going around a roundabout. But traffic signals work better when you've got one major road crossing a few minor roads. And, the small volume of minor road traffic that's held up by the green lights to get the big volumes through on the main roads is the efficiency is greater in a traffic signal than in a roundabout in that case. But it's then you've got to design that intersection to be relatively safer. And no one's been able to design a traffic signal at grade traffic signal intersection that's been safer than a roundabout. Because there are too many conflicts in turning movements and people running red lights and things like that.
So we are almost in the last phase of our podcast. So the last question to you, which is a little bit philosophical: what does Australia's transport history tell us about Australian psychology? Or can any public transport says about it?
Australia has essentially grown up mostly in modern Australia with the car, and cities have been built with the car in mind and expanded especially with the car in mind. It's only the oldest centres of some of the older cities, like Sydney's downtown area or Melbourne's hobble grid, where the roads were designed and built for horse and carriages and perhaps trams and cable trams and things like that. It's been so most of Australia's growth and history has been in the company of the motor car. And that's why I think public transport always used to be the primary form of transport, because no one could afford it, or before cars were available, they were the best way to get around. But the car took over and the cities were built with the car in mind. If you look at subdivision of a residential area full of cul-de-sacs and curving roads and so on. Very unfriendly for pedestrians because there's a lack of permeability. You can't walk in straight lines to get through that sort of development. And they're designed for cars and really to be best used by cars rather than anything else. So, and to then try and retrofit public transport back into those spaces is quite difficult because the buses are often too big to get down some of the residential streets or around the small roundabouts and things like that. So I think that's one of the reasons why it's now getting very hard to put in good quality public transport, because we haven't really reserved the rights of way to be able to do that in our planning. And instead, the roads tend to dominate, as I said before, dominate the urban landscape more than anything else.
Mm.
So that's had a strong influence, I think, and the way that the history of growth of cities in Australia, and in particular then more recent, perhaps, the development of malls and shopping centres, where there are shopping areas which are surrounded by car parks, large car parks, and they're very pedestrian unfriendly and bus unfriendly, public transport unfriendly. The easiest way to go there is to go and park your car as close to the shops as possible and walk out with a trolley and put your shopping in and so on. And that's been a strong feature of growth in Australia. If you think about how many of car-dependent shopping centres there are everywhere.
Mm. So it's like a society, it's like a social phenomenon. It's like a combination of many designs and many things are changing and all these things. So anyway, so on that, we end our podcast here. Thank you, William. Thank you for your wisdom.
Thank you.